So the Devil May Cry Netflix anime dropped its second season, and I immediately have to say this is the worst Devil May Cry has ever been. Sure, you could argue the era of the reboot, but I'm honestly at the point where I'm about to argue for the reboot over this series. Not only is this show just painfully bad, but it's honestly a joke of what I even like about Devil May Cry in the first place. Now, I want to stress this, and I'm going to continue to stress this throughout the video. If you like this series, please do not take this review as an offense or a way to demean how you personally feel. If you truly enjoyed this show and liked what it offered, that's fine and respectable. You are entitled to that opinion. But in the same way that you're entitled to your opinion, I'm entitled to mine. Spoilers for anyone who hasn't watched this show, of course. In this review, I'll just talk about some plot threads and characters, but mostly the characters since I feel the appeal of DMC has always been its combat and its cast. I also would like to say that while there are some things I could address or nitpick, like the mannequins here not being Lucia, and Lucia just not really having any relevance in the show that has Devil May Cry 2 characters, I could also address stuff like some of the lore bits that weren't adapted into the anime, some of the demons showing up and having less purpose in the game, and a couple other things. I don't want to cover those topics all too much since I don't feel like they're super important, so I'll start off with like a few positives and mostly just talk about the characters in the show, since I feel that they are the strongest part, but at the same time the weakest, if that really makes sense. Again, spoilers for anybody who actually wants to watch this show, but if you're not really worried about spoilers, then go ahead and continue forward. So the main appeal of this season was Dante versus Virgil, and Virgil of himself, of course. I have to say, Virgil was actually not that bad. He could have been a little bit better, as I do feel like he doesn't have the same things that the games made me love about him, but he's still not too bad. He has a few cool moments here and there, and the voice performance by Robbie Daymond is actually pretty good. It's not no Dan Southworth, but I still enjoy the performance by Robbie Daymond in general. Action sequences were cool, but I was a bit thrown off by Virgil's inconsistent power level, which Dante also suffers from, but we'll talk about that when we get to Dante's section. There's many instances in the show where Virgil could have blitzed or killed someone, but chose not to for the sake of banter, dialogue, or some other weird cliche thing that kind of just feels empty in its presentation. Namely in the first episode when he gets tased by a group of soldiers and a rage power-up causes him to break free of everything, then runs around and kills everyone, despite later events showing us how easily he could have just speed blitzed, dodged bullets, deflected bullets, and overpowered everyone there. He also uses a summoned sword, but he never does that again, despite the fact that there are many situations within the show where he could have used it. And in my head, I'm thinking to myself, well, if he has the summoned swords, why wouldn't he use it in the situations where it could have been convenient for him? Why not use it in scenarios where it's actually good to use the summoned swords? Like when he intended to shoot the soldiers that, or not shoot the soldiers, but the ones that tried to attack him by shooting him in the neck. He could have easily just thrown a summoned sword there. Even when he's fighting the desert soldiers in general, he spawns a summoned sword, but instead of summoning it by either having it float around him, deflect, or just shank people, he uses it barehanded despite the games displaying that the summoned swords are always floating around him, swirling and either acting as a shield or just his own version of projectiles. Or even a way for him to teleport to somebody. I'm also still not entirely a fan of Virgil being Mundus' underling. While it works to an extent, building off the basis that Virgil's ideals are manipulated and twisted from what was his mother's pure feelings and him becoming a villain, I feel like it isn't as interesting to me. It just feels sort of hollow, and I'm personally not swayed by Virgil's characterization in this show. Mundus delivering the Devils Never Cry line isn't entirely terrible, but it feels a bit off that out of all the characters who could have said it like Dante, Ava, or even Lady, Mundus is the one who says it. But above all else, I do like that Virgil's arc concludes with him choosing himself over everything else. It does give him some agency, which I initially was worried about, feeling that him as a Mundus underling would lack agency, but now it's actually self-driven and he wants to be the ruler of hell, which is akin to the games, I feel, and it's not the best in its execution as I was a bit bored with it personally. I still feel like it was mostly just game Virgil at least being on the handle this time instead of whatever version they had. It feels a bit empty, shallow, sure, but at least they got the bare minimum right for Virgil's characterization in that segment. I also am not exactly a fan of Virgil being the weaker twin between him and Dante, or the one that's less refined, the one that's always messing up. It might work for the show, but once again, and I will repeat this consistently throughout the video, I'm not exactly fond of how some of the show establishes its character stuff, and one of them, again, is Virgil being the weaker twin and less refined. In Visions of V, Virgil and Dante are equals. There is no implied favorite from their mom. Sure, their mom does give them both like good lessons, but at the very same time, there's not a twin that she prefers, and none of them are better over the other. They're just equals, and that's just how it always has been. Even the games in DMC 3 and onwards establishes Dante and Virgil were purely equals, never one better than the other. Sure, they had aspects that might have been better, like Dante's humanity being stronger, Virgil's demon side being stronger, and all other things like that. But overall, they were equal. They balanced each other out well, and that's what made sense. I also think that Virgil being given the Yamato was a bit iffy for me personally, considering the fact that in the manga, again, he summons it to him and forges his ideals of being alone. His ideals of power was all born out of his loneliness, out of him being the only person there, miles and miles away from his home, and being attacked by himself, and believing that he has to rely on himself. It instills the idea of Virgil believing that might controls all and explains why he's alone. And his avoidance of weakness makes him compelling because he's afraid to feel weak, because that's how he felt when he was attacked. He was attacked and he was weakened, and he doesn't want to feel weak again. The show displays him as otherwise, and it feels kind of empty at points and less compelling than his game counterpart. And I understand that it's not the same universe, but to call this show an adaptation just feels frustrating because if you're going to adapt aspects of the game, at least get the core fundamentals right. Despite this, I do like Virgil in the show, but he's nowhere near as interesting or compelling as his game counterpart. The game counterpart, Virgil, just feels so much more interesting, so much more rich and likable as both an antagonist and just a character in general. I feel sorry for him, and I'm not saying that the anime Virgil didn't make me feel bad at all. In fact, I do like what they did in some aspects, but at the same time, the lack of his ideals being formed by himself at some points, on top of him just not really having that same character of him being equal to Dante, but just having a few things that balance it out, and him instead just being weaker, and that's why he's not fond of Dante, just felt a bit weird, but again, it could have been worse, and it's somewhat enjoyable. Now, while I could easily cover Arius, Baines, or Mundus, I was indifferent about them. They weren't bad, but they weren't really crazy either. Just a bit better than what I expected, and I'd argue somewhat more interesting than Rabbit. But to focus on Lady, I think she's a bit more bearable this season. Yet at the same time, I'm still not entirely okay with this character being Lady from what I know as Lady in the games. They do tone down her potty mouth, which I think was definitely good since her cussing so much kind of made me dislike the character. But there's so many instances where she has ridiculous plot armor and moments where she just straight up should have died or been killed. But she never does. Like, for instance, the mannequin holds her in the air and then tosses her up to catch her instead of just letting her fall to her demise, which would have been so much more easier and convenient for her. Or like when Arya swings the sword and Dante rages and saves her, which felt beyond generic. Maybe if this was Nero and Kyrie, I could have let it slide, but it still feels off. There's also when they slash and literally cut her. She should have died. She should have literally been killed. They should have garroted her, cut her open, etc. But instead, they just slash her body, give her a couple of cuts on the nose and the cheeks and the legs and arms, and then they just drop her and she falls through the building. And they don't finish her off either. Right before the mannequin chick dies, she also opts to talk and banter with Lady instead of killing her because Lady is under the impression that, hey, the mannequin was real the whole time, but it was actually a clone. And instead of getting the jump on her, she opts to just talk to her and say, haha, you fell for it, and then lets herself be shot by a little girl, which, again, feels kind of ridiculous, but whatever. It's plot armor, and honestly, it could have been ultimately worse. I do want to address, though, her relationship with Dante, as I feel Lady drives their relationship so much more than Dante, and I'll get into that in Dante's section. But her relationship by concept isn't terrible, as Dante and Lady in the games have a connection that feels very platonic. They're more than friends and comfortable around each other, yet they're never romantically involved with each other. Granted, this could be because of Dante and Lady not feeling that either of them is fit to date or anything of that sort, but the point still stands. In the show, Lady falls for him despite her relationship with him feeling very rushed and underdeveloped. There's very rarely much time for her to ever be shown as actually falling in love with him, and most of it is just she feels bad for him, feels guilty, and wants to help. Following this, she also agrees and affirms to most of the things he does, despite, again, not much screen time being dedicated to them actually developing their dynamic of loving each other. Their love feels very rushed and not really deserved, compared to, again, Nero and Kyrie, where Nero and Kyrie feel very deserved. Granted, it could have been executed much better with the way that Nero and Kyrie were developed, but at the same time, you still get the idea and implication that Nero and Kyrie were always like this. They always were close to each other and their feelings developed. And that's how it was meant to be for those two. And then again, for Dante, it feels like he's mostly just clowning around and Lady is driving their conversations. Lady drives their relationship, and it feels like Dante has less agency in some of the actions that the two of them have. Did they really have to date though? Did they really needed to have an implicated sex scene? It feels genuinely empty and lacks any real catharsis since the two characters barely have much screen time dedicated to dating. I will say that I do like where the show left Lady off, giving her the motivation of finding her father and getting revenge. It's a neat setup, and Lady's character feels somewhat better this season, but it's the bare minimum. I want to say hopefully the next season can deliver something good, but I'm not really looking forward to much. I also do like her two outfits, as I originally wasn't fond of them, but over time they've grown on me. So overall, not really bad. I do still somewhat think that she's not good as a character and she's at times unrecognizable as Lady, but hey, she's better this time, and I guess that's what matters. Now, before I discuss Dante, I just want to say that I like the plot of the show. I like the whole Mundus versus Argisax setup, and thoroughly enjoyed some of the fights in the show. While some bits of the dialogue and dynamics felt lackluster and empty, and I genuinely felt myself zoning out at some points because the characters are just not really compelling, and at times feel very hollow compared to their game counterparts, even at times just genuinely not being interesting, I still enjoyed what I did and I had fun with some aspects of the show. The animation wasn't bad, and I guess the music wasn't entirely terrible, but I felt like this show was just one big AMV with the amount of music that they played, like Virgil raging and Bodies playing, or Korn playing, literally anything. It mostly felt like just a giant AMV, and I'm not really a fan of it. Some may like it, and if you like it, that's fine. But personally, I wasn't a fan of it, and it's just not for me personally. I thought the inclusion of certain demons wasn't bad, but I do hate that it sometimes feels like a way for someone to just point at the screen and say, "Oh my god, the Fury! Oh my god, Beowulf! Nevin! Look at these characters!" But now, let's get to Dante. And I just want to say that I am deeply, truly sorry that if this offends anyone. So I'm going to start this off really hard. Dante fucking sucks in this show. Now, you could call this an exaggeration, but I genuinely, literally cannot stand this character. This character is not the same guy that I looked at in the games and called my GOAT. The only time I kind of rocked with him is his joke from the trailer about Argisax being a ventriloquist. Outside of that, his characterization is awful and borderline insulting to me personally. Now, the show addresses the idea that Dante's always been this way, like even as a kid, but the difference is that his attitude covers up his past because he's afraid to face it. That's why he's cocky, that's why he makes jokes, and all of that stuff. Fair enough. But aside from that, it's just not really compelling. I feel nothing towards this version of Dante at all. There are many times as well that he could have speed blitzed someone and didn't. I brought this up with Virgil, but with Dante, it just is ridiculous. There are so many times that Dante could have speed blitzed his opponents. And one of the goofiest moments is when Nell Goldstein shoots like a rocket or something, and Dante is shocked by it, despite the fact that in Season 1, we literally see Dante move fast enough to where the soldiers think, oh, he's still in front of us, but he's actually shooting alongside them. They consistently get the power level wrong for this character, and he always feels weak and like a chump. Not only does he feel like a protagonist that tries to be cool but fails, he's so background coded. Most of this show felt like Lady and Virgil were taking the wheel, versus Dante, who feels minor compared to everything going on. Even his relationship with Lady doesn't feel like he matters much because Lady's the driving force and Dante's just there for the ride. Very rarely did I ever feel Dante's presence in this show as the main character. And it doesn't help that he apparently struggles to use his devil trigger form, so he has to do some bullshit like believe in his heart to make it work, like he's Jin Kazama or some shit. It is the most generic Super Saiyan Ninetales transformation ass thing I've ever seen. And that doesn't work for Dante as a character from the games because that's not how it worked in the first place. And it makes it even more so that he specifically does it when his Shayla, his baby girl, lady's in trouble. I'm not going to say Dante never got angry in the games. Of course he did. We know this. He's always done this. He's gotten angry multiple times, but he manifested his anger in a way that felt different from a shonen protagonist versus Netflix Dante, who feels like a shonen hero and it feels so generic that it hurts. Maybe if this was Nero, I could excuse this since Nero's characterization fits the shonen archetype. I mean, we've literally seen this happen in both Devil May Cry 4 and 5, where Nero gets angry enough for him to transform. Also, Dante not having control over his form, again, works for the show maybe, but it feels so meaningless. In the games, he had immediate finesse, but here he struggles constantly and it gets boring to see that time and time again. Not to mention that Dante loses so many of his fights and it makes it hard to believe that this guy is the son of Sparta. How am I supposed to believe that this guy's the son of Sparta when he's losing against these mannequin clones that Lady can also deal with? The power levels just feel so inconsistent at times. Sure, he doesn't have a full handle on his powers, but what made him cool in the games was seeing the proof that he is the son of Sparta. He had style, finesse, classy, and he was confident. Even when he was trying out new weapons, it wasn't necessarily, oh, he had a handle of instantly. You could tell that when he was trying a new weapon, he was trying to understand it. He was trying to understand its power, its full potential. Like King Cerberus in DMC 5, where he spins it and turns it into a spear and whatnot, to truly understand the potential of why that weapon is so strong and why he should keep it. But here in the show, he feels lame, uninteresting, uninspired, and frankly insufferable at times. It doesn't feel like Dante, but it feels like an entirely different character. At the very least, with the reboot, that version of Dante was intended to be a new version of him. It wasn't good, but that was the purpose. Netflix Dante is supposedly an adaptation of the games, but lacks anything that made Game Dante a compelling protagonist in the very first place. Him constantly losing or struggling feels less interesting and inspires less confidence in this character. How am I supposed to believe that my GOAT Dante is the son of Sparta when he's always losing, always getting tossed up on his ass, and is getting tossed like a damn salad? It's ridiculous. And the show even tries to justify some of this with the idea of, oh, he's holding back to hold back his power or not show his power. But it becomes ridiculous because if he's losing most of his fights because of him holding back, that just makes no sense because why would he need to hold back in scenarios where he shouldn't? There's also the fact that he has very few interesting ties or dynamics with either of the villains, so he interacts with them, sure, but he never feels connected to them. Mundus especially, because most of the turmoil with Mundus is carried by Virgil, and he barely has any beef with Arius outside of Arius just being the main villain. At least with Mundus in the game in Arkham, he felt connected to them. He had direct beef with them, and it allowed the audience to feel that connection, that hatred for said villains, especially Arkham and Mundus. Now, if anyone likes Netflix Dante, that's fine, but I personally cannot bring myself to like this character because he has next to nothing that made me love Game Dante. He talks, moves, and acts like Dante, but he doesn't feel like him. It feels like an empty shell of what a LARPer thinks Dante acts like. The very definition of wacky woohoo pizza guy. It lacks any sense of Dante as a character. And the show's ending doesn't bring his arc to a good conclusion either, the way that Lady or Virgil felt. At least with Lady and Virgil, you could tell, hey, there's some good setup here for a future character arc. But with Dante, he's just there and it just feels miserable and boring. There's nothing going on interesting with him that makes me feel compelled to really like this character. And maybe you could say, why don't you just wait till Season 3? But I'm just not convinced that Season 3 is going to be worth my time. Seriously. Now that we're at the end, I just want to say that I think this season was definitely a major step up from Season 1, but only by not too much. It was definitely better, but it just doesn't really feel that much crazier. Nothing groundbreaking, nothing major. Season 1 was worse, but I still feel like this show has ultimately missed the mark for me. It doesn't really feel like Devil May Cry at a lot of points, and instead feels like pure fan fiction from Tumblr. There are a few moments that feel like DMC, like maybe some of the jokes, some of the action pieces and whatnot, but it just doesn't carry the same weight, style, or charm, let alone the emotion the game's stories capture for me. I know you could say Devil May Cry's never had a concrete story, but I feel like that's missing the point. That DMC does have some fun in its stories and some good moments in its stories. But I guess it could have been worse, and it could have been even more insulting, but it wasn't. It was just painfully lame with a few highlights here and there. And honestly, I don't think I'll be tuning in for the third season because I'm not really too interested in anything from here on to actually want to watch it. So I think I'm just going to skip season 3. All in all, for those who enjoyed, I'm glad you enjoyed the show. I'm glad you found fun in it. But personally, I can't find myself to rate the show any higher than maybe a 5. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Leave a like, subscribe, and yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out, brothers and sisters.